We're recording.
And do we have a quorum, NJ?
We have a quorum.
And this is just a reminder to lean into your microphones when we're speaking so people online can hear us clearly. And also when NJ takes the meeting minutes later, he listens to it, he can hear what everyone's saying. So thank you for leaning in. And the agenda's in front of you. It was sent via NJ earlier with the meeting packet. I'll accept a motion to approve the agenda.
So moved. Second. So moved.
In a second by Brian. All in favor, say aye.
Aye.
Opposed, say nay. Abstentions, motion carries. We also had the meeting minutes from the last meeting, May 17th, 2022. I don't know if there's any discussion on the meeting minutes. I'll accept a motion to approve the meeting minutes.
So moved. Second.
Second, any other discussion? All in favor, say aye.
Aye.
Opposed, say nay. Abstentions, motion carries. Then we do we have any public comment, NJ?
We have no public comment submitted.
Okay, so we'll move on to the next subject. Brendan, would you like to take it from here?
Sure, thank you. So, hi, we'll be talking today about some of the materials that we presented to you folks at the prior meeting and the results of comparing those bits of analysis. I just want to point out that CJ and Darcy are here from MIG. CJ was going to be here, but he isn't feeling great and his voice is a little under the weather. So I'm going to get us started. He'll have a part of the agenda coming up here, but I'm going to try to save his voice. So I'll get us started.
Brendan, maybe we should do introductions again because there are some new people in person here, and then also might be some new people online. Sorry about that. So I'll start, and then we'll go to my right. We'll do in person first, and then we'll do online. I'm Pat Kessy. I'm the chair of the committee, and I'm a community member at large. Tyler?
Tyler Miller, City Council, Scapa City Council.
Pat Turpin, representing the Senior Center.
Michael Sykes, former city manager, and I work for the Columbia River D. I'm the general manager.
Brian Rosenthal, member at large.
NJ Johnson, city staff.
I'm Brendan Buckley. I'm a consultant with Johnson Economics.
Lori Joseph, City Staff, Community Development Director.
Jeff Weiss, Library Director.
Jennifer Anderson, Executive Director for Columbia County Habitat for Humanity.
I'm Debbie Jacob, Senior Planner with Columbia County Land Development Services.
Casey Garrett, Columbia County Commissioner.
And Kim Holmes, representing the Parks and Rec Committee.
All right, and then I'm just going to go as I see him on my screen. So CJ.
Hi, everyone. CJ Doxey with MIG. Sorry I couldn't be there tonight, but appreciate being able to attend remotely. Thank you.
Darcy.
Good evening, Darcy Rudzinski, MIG, a principal, and I'm supporting the project.
Craig.
Hi, Craig Campbell. I'm the Executive Director at OMIC R&D.
Paul.
Paul Vogel, Executive Director, Columbia Economic Team.
Jeanette.
Jeanette Santiago, City Council, and also representing the underrepresented.
And Nicole.
Nicole Ferreira, Scappoose Bay Watershed Council.
All right, that's it.
Wonderful, thank you. Can everyone hear Brendan when I think your mic?
Can you hear me now?
Speak into the mic, please, so everyone can hear you all right.
I'm just not close enough. Okay.
Okay, thank you very much.
Sure. Hi, everyone. Good to be back. We were here in April. We're working on the part of the overall 50-year plan that is the housing needs analysis and the residential buildable land analysis. And if you recall, when we were here in April, we presented our first draft analysis of sort of the demand side for housing and land and the supply side or the buildable land inventory. And we went over some of those results with you folks. Since then, we've been to the town meeting that was held at the end of April. I know that you've also been working on the other aspects of the 50-year plan moving forward at the same time. Tonight, we want to come back and kind of talk about a couple things. One is what's called the residential land needs analysis. And what that really is just a comparison of our demand analysis to the final buildable land inventory. Once we get those two pieces kind of finalized, then you go, the next step is to compare the two and see what it really says. So looking at your 20 years of demand, what does that mean compared to your current inventory? So we're going to talk about that tonight. I'll review a little bit the findings of the previous work just to refresh memory. And then after that, we're going to get into really what's going to be the next phases of our work, which is measures to accommodate needed housing. So that's a set of tools and strategies that we're going to be coming up with and speaking with you about, sort of talking about what comes next. What do the results of this study mean? And so tonight we're going to introduce sort of the general approach we're going to take to that and some of the general strategies that we'd like to talk about. And we can have some question and discussion time about that. Before I get started, CJ, did you have anything you wanted to add to that intro?
No, I think that covers it. Just to reiterate that, you know, this may be a relatively quick meeting compared to probably some others. It just depends on how much discussion we generate. But as far as the measures to accommodate needed housing, this being more of a preview, we'll have more dedicated time at the subsequent meetings to take a deeper dive into those topics.
So as I said, here's where we're kind of at in the process. You see the two things we talked about last time are in gray, and this is tonight we're talking about the residential land needs, and then the strategies are really going to follow on and be the next major steps. So to review a little bit what we found last time, what we presented, we found the 20-year housing need going out to the year 2043. You're going to have about 2,000 new residents, we project, 930 new households, and need for over 1,000 new units in that time. On the right is a breakdown of what we thought those units may need to be based on demographics and based on House Bill 2001 and the need for rental units and so on. So you still see that a large share of the needed housing is for single family homes, but you see also a projected need for additional types of housing, small plexes, townhomes, and then also some apartments. On the land inventory side, we found, we went through the process, if you remember, of talking about how to we remove constraints such as waterways, wetlands, steep slopes, and things like that from the inventory to try to narrow down to the acreage and the parcels that that can be developed, and some of those are partially vacant. Perhaps part of it is obstructed by a slope or a wetland or something like that. And so we go through the process of trying to narrow down which parts of those parcels can be developed. We found a grand total within the city limits of 137 acres. Most of that acreage is in the partially vacant category, about 50 acres in the fully vacant category. And you'll see here, it's also broken down by the zones. And so not all of your residential zones have much or any remaining buildable land in them. And some have more than others. Most of your inventory is in the R1 and R4 lower density residential zones. The reasons that your commercial zones are here is because that is where your multifamily housing is permitted and where most of it has been taking place. So we'll be talking a little bit more about that, but that's why the commercial zones are shown here. Then there's also the area that's outside of your current city limits, but inside your urban growth boundary. And Scappoose does have quite a bit of that. And so we found an additional, over 100 acres in those areas. And but again, most of those are in the partially vacant category. And those are all lands that would need to, come into the city before they can be fully developed. On the right is a map of what is developed versus vacant. The green is vacant, yellow is partially vacant, and red is mostly developed or constrained. I know you can't see individual properties on this little map, but you get the general idea maybe of where some of that acreage that's considered buildable is located. In this table, we take those estimates we had of the acreage in each of these zones and break down how many housing units we think that would accommodate. So again, the total capacity we find for new housing units within the current city limits is a little over 700 units, about 725. When you look at the UGB area, that's an additional 500 units. But again, a lot of those are showing up in the partially vacant categories. We apply to come up with estimates of capacity. We're applying assumptions of the projected density of the different housing types in those zones. Generally, actually, next slide, I'll talk a little bit more about how we break that down. So comparing the supply and demand, this gets into what's called the residential land needs analysis. Excuse me. We start by looking at really breaking it down into broader categories of low density, medium density, and high density. And we talk about the types of housing that might appear in those different broad sort of zoning categories. So low density is considered to be less than 8 acres. Medium density here is considered to be 8 to 12 acres. And high density is considered to be more than 12 acres. So I'm sorry, yes, units per acre. So what we've done is taken our findings of available acres and converted that into a unit capacity. The average densities you see here come out a little bit low. That has to do with the nature of the individual parcels that are actually in the inventory. But generally, these housing types you see are what we have in mind for sort of hitting those densities. The reason that the average density shown here in your high density category is so low is because those acres are in your commercial zones, and we have not assumed that all of that acreage will be developed as residential. Some of it is still needed to be developed as commercial, and so that's why the sort of the blended density comes out lower. But the overall impact is you see that of those 245 acres, you have the 1,200, a little over 1,200 housing unit capacity. And then on the right, we're comparing that to the finding or the projected 20-year need for housing units of a little over 1,000 units. And what we find is when we break down the projected need as we had it broken down between these different housing types, that there is a likely surplus of land in your low density housing residential categories, and a likely need for additional land in your medium density and high density categories to accommodate the forecasted housing needs for the medium and high density housing types. Are there questions about this?
That's for the urban growth boundary and the existing city limits.
Yes, this is for the total urban growth boundary.
Brian Rosenthal. Question. I know it's probably not a lot of units, but I believe you guys went with a 20 or 25% slope as considering anything less than that buildable. I thought that the city requires a variance for anything over 15%. And if so, I would think that if you have to get a variance, it shouldn't be included in the inventory.
Look at that. Go ahead.
I can speak to that. The issue of variances isn't something that we can necessarily consider a factor for removing, because even though a variance can be cost prohibitive, it does add additional cost. It still is developable in some respect if they're able to get that variance.
Well, but if the variance isn't guaranteed, wouldn't you at least take a ratio? Like you would anything else that had a potential thing? It's not a tremendous number of units. It just seems like we don't have a lot of land that we can ask for, and I'm just hoping that we can find a way to add some more land inventory. So I know it's a small item, but there are some areas that I know that have steep slope.
Yeah, I would need to double check on that. As far as I'm aware, I'm not, as far as these projects go for variances, that sort of thing, we haven't done a ratio. I'm not aware of any sort of precedent of other people doing a ratio along those lines. So I would need to double check and maybe confer with DLCD on that.
Thank you.
Jeff, did you have a comment?
Yeah, Jeff Weiss. Maybe this isn't the point of in the discussion to do this, but do you have any insight on a kind of percentage for partially developed land that ends up getting developed during one of these processes? Because, you know, just because I have an acre of land with my house on it doesn't mean I'm going to sell part of that to you to develop.
Right. Oh, go ahead.
Oh, I was just going to say that is a real concern, but it's also part of the process that there's a system set up for how to calculate that partial acreage, and it does need to be included in the inventory, because essentially the idea is that you know, you really want to get as best idea of the actual land you have in your urban growth boundary before you talk about adding more, and so it errs on the side of counting, essentially.
Michael,
Just wanted to ask another question. Could we maybe back up one step and look at the map, and could you kind of identify, the areas that you think are projected for? You mentioned there's 200 and some acres. I'm just curious if you can identify where they are, and so just a little bit more detail. It looks like a number of large parcels.
And it's in here too, Michael, printed. Yeah.
you could speak into your mic a little bit more too, that'd be great.
CJ, do you want to, can you handle that one?
Yeah, if I understand the question correctly, and so correct me if I'm wrong, the question is a little more detail in terms of where those are. Is that how I'm hearing it? Is that what
That's
I'm hearing?
correct.
Okay.
Yeah.
So again, as you can see off of the table here, almost 3/4 of the total land supply is coming from partially vacant areas. And this is after, excuse me, after accounting for environmental constraints like slopes or wetlands or floodways or things like that. So with that in mind, a lot of your partially vacant areas are coming from the area east, kind of the eastern area of Scappoose and south of the airport there. There's quite a few number of parcels that fit the safe harbor rules for what is considered partially vacant. And just to recap what that is, if parcel is over half an acre in size, then you deduct a quarter of an acre from that and assume that the remaining amount is buildable. So a number of those properties fit that criteria. They're over a half acre of size. And so you get a lot of like spaces where you can get, 2 or 3 units, additional units on those lots over there. On the southwestern area, kind of as you're going out, there, you get a lot of different, a lot of larger size partially vacant parcels, and that includes both inside and outside the UGB. The partially vacant properties outside of the UGB is expected because those are usually relatively larger lots, an acre or a few acres in size that do have a house on it, but when they get annexed at some point over some period of time, then it's very likely that they would produce, 10, 15, 20 or more houses, depending on it. I don't think there isn't very many extremely large lots where you're going to get big subdivisions on. So you're not going to get like a single thing with a single subdivision with, it's not likely you'll get a subdivision with like 50 to 100 units on it. But yeah, a lot of that growth is going to be mostly in the kind of that southwest, that western leg that juts off there, and then in the eastern part. You'll also notice that there's a kind of a bigger yellow partially vacant area in the northern part, but I think that's a little misleading based off of this map here because a large part of it is constrained. A lot of it is in the wetlands, so the actual estimated buildable capacity there is relatively low compared to the amount of land that's in there.
And you got that right in the center of, on the, what is that, the western central, you have that big green section there. That looks like the largest, most viable piece in the city.
Yeah, and part of that is the park, and that aspect of it's been deducted from the buildable capacity there.
Okay.
But yes, you are right.
Just for perspective, our ratio of vacant to partially vacant land, how does that compare to other kind of similar communities? Is it extraordinary? Is it normal?
It can be anywhere. You can see any spectrum of it, of results in that way. I would say that, it's probably have a higher share in partially vacant than in many communities I've seen. But it's not unheard of. Yeah.
So it's just standard infill.
Yeah, and it happens in communities like Scappoose that have brought in areas that are kind of rural residential, and those lots are big, and so they count as partially vacant. And depending on where they are, they really might, you really might see some infill there. If there's, for instance, an older rural home without much value, and it can be replaced by, 6 houses, you do see that kind of thing. But you also see longtime property owners who, that's their house and their big lot, and they're not interested in going anywhere. So the process is really meant to keep focusing on that 20-year time frame and think, well, that house could pass on. It could be time for them to sell that property. It could pass down to heirs who don't want to live there, and they might want to see what else they can do with it. So that's kind of the idea of including it in a longer time frame.
So it's more likely the larger pieces. It's not like, hey, I have an acre, I'd like to give up half. It's more likely the larger pieces that we hope would one day want to give it up for development.
I can't speak to what the community might like to see in that regard, but
It's not up, is it up to the community or just the private landowner?
it's generally up to the landowners. Yeah, it's all private lots.
This might be a silly question or naive. So what happens when we get to the end of our term and those 915 partially vacant pieces, they're holding strong? We don't have the prediction.
Yeah, so there is a process. I mean, what we'll be getting into in terms of talking about housing measures is if there's real reason to think that any of this buildable land inventory simply will not happen, we can talk about that, but it's a high bar. And if the community feels that any of these areas are really not going to develop, then it's a process of actually removing that area from the urban growth boundary. It's not, and replacing it with something else. It's not just, you can't leave it there and sort of argue we don't think much is going to happen there, and therefore we need an equal amount of land somewhere else.
I almost think that someone like a Mr. Sykes, Michael, I'm talking about you, Michael, I'm talking about you. Somebody like Mr. Sykes could probably recognize these pieces of property, know that family, and know whether they're going to give it up ever.
Yeah, I'd say
Just as an audit.
I think I guess I would just repeat what I said. Right? If you did decide that about a major property or something, then you'd have to think about that action. That would actually need to come out of the urban growth boundary if you wanted to replace it one for one with something else.
And so that was a point that we included for this project, was to look at a UGB swap of lands. Knowing that this area out Raymond Creek, it's going to be a lot harder for us to serve with utilities. And so that's definitely something that will be looked at for this portion of the project with MIG and APG on board. They're looking at the 20-year, right? So this is just their snapshot for their project that we got our DLCD grant for. Echo Northwest then will take the 20-year look and expand it out to have a total of a 50-year look. After we do that and we look at all the other land needs, park needs, public land needs for city offices, et cetera, schools, all the other considerations, then we'll have a better look to see kind of where we're at. But for this component of the study, it's just the 20-year, and we're just trying to get a baseline of what land we're starting with, because we know there's issues. We don't have the zoning is not matching up, basically, is what they're showing here. There's a deficit of some types of land based on zoning and current uses allowed. So we'll have to definitely dig into that, and the committee and the council and the planning commissioners come to some agreement and make some decisions, because there's going to be policy choices to make here.
Brian Rosenthal question. Am I correct that if somebody's currently in our UGB and the city wanted to take them out of the UGB to put another piece in because they were going to be hard to service, wouldn't they have to voluntarily agree to such a thing, or it could be considered a taking?
It's a really great question, Brian. I don't know the answer to that, but that's super curious. That's a great point. CJ, do you know, or Darcy?
I don't know about that. I do know that for the process of doing a UGB swap, you have to go through quite a public process.
Yeah.
Involves a lot of meetings and outreach and hearings. But as far as the takings aspect of it, that's something I would need to double check.
Right, and I think the only thing that I would add to Brendan and CJ's comments is that, you know, private property owners would be foregoing that future development possibility. So taking the land out of the urban growth boundary basically relegates it to, you know, rural ag, you know, not developable. And that, of course, is challenging for property owners and family members to, you know, kind of close the door on the possibility of being served by city services and having, you know, property, you know, turn to something that is more profitable.
Can I weigh in on that just for a second?
Yes, Michael.
I was just going to say that, you know, the biggest constraint with that area up in Raymond Creek is it doesn't have sewer. It is in this urban growth boundary, and I think it's under the R5 zone with county, and you can develop it up to 2 acres, I think. I'm not the county planner. I can't do that anymore.
Sorry, the only provision we have in rural residential zone is for more higher density in the rural residential zone is for rural residential properties that are 2 acres or larger are allowed to have 1 ADU. That's a second permanent dwelling, but that dwelling unit is limited to 900 square feet. There's other provisions, but that's the only way that we can get more than the one house on the property.
I guess the thing I wanted to say is that, you know, we had a number of people that had shown interest in trying to annex, but they weren't, they're in the urban growth boundary, but they're not contiguous, and to provide services is going to be really cost prohibitive. So a lot of that area on the east is probably not going to develop. The Raymond Creek sewers is at Coal Creek, so it's a mile plus. So that's going to be expensive. So I don't see those areas developing anytime soon. But I guess at the end of the day, I think that this is really valuable because it gives us kind of a real overall sense of our challenges and opportunities as we move forward and looking at 50 years. So I think it's good information. So.
And it's good feedback for the consultants too, because they'll be taking this feedback and giving it to the city council when you report to the city council. But any feedback is very welcomed with this. You want to continue, Brendan?
Thank you. Yeah, this is all very good discussion and good pointed questions for us to follow up on. So we saw the results here. I quickly want to talk about, there's an appendix to the official housing needs analysis report that talks about a couple of alternative growth rates that are higher. I want to talk about that briefly, but I need to remind everyone that the growth rate that we've used here is the official sort of last forecasted growth rate from Portland State University's Population Research Center. And we are required to use that by statute. And so we talked about providing a couple of different alternatives, maybe just for planning purposes and to give an idea of what might be different if there is higher growth. But in terms of the official H&A report, just a reminder that we do need to use this baseline growth rate. So that baseline growth rate, which underlies the numbers, all the numbers we were just talking about, came out to a growth rate of 1% per year. That translated to a population in 2043 of approaching 11,000 people. So the other growth rates we looked at were two. One was the growth rate of 1.3%, which is the growth rate that there's complicated reasons, but that was the previous PSU growth rate essentially before the census, the 2020 census came along and kind of messed it up. So it was at 1.3%. So if we look at that, if we still had that to go by, the population would be approaching 11,500. The need for housing would be about 300 more units. And then we would get into an overall acreage need of 3 acres. So then you're getting into a place where even the supply of low density residential land will be coming up short. And then for the adjusted the second adjusted rate was 1.8% per year. That was the rate that was used in your prior housing needs analysis before we got the new forecast from Portland State. So in that analysis, it was a higher 1.8% per year. And then you get a future population of about 12,500 and the need for new housing units that are more approaching 2,000 units. And a greater need for land of 92 acres. So these are in a memo that's sort of presented as an appendix to that report with more detail in there if you'd like to look at that. Are there questions about those alternative growth rates? It's pretty straightforward. You apply a higher growth rate and you're going to see more growth. But one reason that you might want to start thinking about this now is, as we've discussed, the city will be talking to PSU about their next round of forecasts. They do it every 3 years. 3 years can go by pretty fast in planning processes. So it's not a bad idea to go ahead and start thinking about that. And you might be able to use some of this information to talk to PSU next time about whether this growth rate we have to work with was the best one to use.
Wait, can you remind us when the baseline growth rate was and then when they adjusted to was? How many years ago was that?
So the last
study
was done in.
Well, the last housing needs analysis, yeah, it was adopted in January 2018.
18 is the baseline.
Well, 2018, they used the 1.8%. The baseline here is for us now.
I believe in 2018 was right before they sort of implemented this process of using PSU's numbers. So that 1.8 they came up with that through a different approach, different methodology. But in that time period, the state was really going through the rules for this and for how to do the same thing for employment lands, and a whole new set of rules came out of that process in the meantime. Okay. Do you have another?
And then the baseline was when was the last?
I'm sorry.
Analysis?
So this baseline came from they adopted it in 2020.
20?
Yes. So they adopted it, and it was their estimate of what the current population was a little low. So they estimated in 2020 a certain growth rate that came out to the 1.3. We've since found out that from the census that the current population is actually a little higher, but we still have to use this final number. So the baseline moved. Final number for 2043 can't move until they do another one. So that's why it got compressed to 1%.
I have a question, and it's probably no, but I can't help myself. I got to ask this. So we've got all this land that may be very difficult to develop. And I understand the first choice would be to have them voluntarily agree to come out of the UGB. But let's say they say no. Could we then, at that point, possibly declare it as unbuildable or a percentage of it as unbuildable so that we could add additional land? Or is that just not going to be possible in this process?
I don't know of any, see, I can leave it to these guys, but I don't know of any process. You'd have to rezone it to essentially preclude.
So if it's in,
Development.
so it's really not based on developableness of the land. It's just purely based on the zoning.
No, they go through the exercise to see if it's vacant, partially vacant, etc. But there's assumptions and rules baked into that they're following. And so, you know, my assumption thinking about this holistically is every city needs to follow certain guidelines. So we're all looking at it the same, right? I mean, there has to be a way.
Well, let me give you an example of something
ahead.
that happened
Yep.
about 10 years ago. I was on the committee that worked with the commercial lands expansion. And we were allowed to look at a piece of land and say, oh my God, it's full of tree trunks. It's very unlikely to get developed. So we could take it out of our inventory based on that, or we could adjust for it.
I'm curious if it's the difference between it being an EOA and an HNA.
Yeah, so there are some major differences
Okay, so
between the two. When you look at employment land,
I'm just reaching.
No, that's good. Ask
good
away. Site characteristics play into an EOA in a different way than they would for an HNA.
Okay.
Hey, Lori.
thank you.
For us non-planning people, I don't know what you're saying.
Housing needs analysis.
That's that part.
Okay, so the way that so the EOA is the economic opportunities analysis, and it's similar to the housing needs, except for it's looking at employment land. But the way that they go through that exercise to determine what's vacant, partially vacant, et cetera, also has some additional components like site suitability, right? So based on, say, the industry Scappoose is looking for or is well positioned for, that will have certain site characteristics. And so when we get into that portion of the study, it's just it's coming from a different set of rules in how that gets categorized. And that's the difference here in what Brian was asking.
Thank you.
I was going to move into the next part of the agenda, which is talking about some of the housing measures, some of which touch on the types of things we've already been getting into. Were there questions on these forecasts or the land needs analysis before I move on? Think of any? If you think of any as we move on, just go ahead and ask, and we can go back.
I think just to clarify when the new PSU study and analysis is going to be finished. Lori, can you talk about the timeline on that?
Yeah, my understanding is that it'll come out in, they'll have preliminaries in March of 2023, right? So the last one came out in 2020, so it's right around the corner. But our thought was to use sort of this appendix that Brendan has put together for us, along with a letter of concern from the city attorney, to submit that well ahead of time so that they have that information and can take it into consideration as they're putting their forecast together. And so I've already mentioned that to Peter Watts, our city attorney, and I'm going to work with him on that.
Thank you. Go ahead, Brendan. Actually, is there any other discussion before Brendan moves on to the measures? Okay, go ahead.
So we will move on to talking about these. I'm going to turn it over to CJ.
Hello, everybody. CJ Doxey, MIG, talking remotely. So again, apologize for not being in person, but I ask for a little graciousness with my gravelly voice and all that fun stuff. I'm going to spend a few minutes essentially doing a preview of the next steps or the second half of this housing needs analysis. And there are more or less kind of two components to it. That first component is going to be a look at your comprehensive plan itself You have a chapter in your comprehensive plan that basically essentially just captures the previous housing needs analysis and documents the findings that were done there, and puts together a number of different policy statements that the city can use for informing land use decisions as it moves forwards for meeting that housing need. That's as part of this, we're going to go through and look at your comprehensive plan and look at updating your findings. We'll essentially put together a new set of findings that will replace your findings from the previous HNA. And then we're also going to do a pretty comprehensive review of your housing policies and make sure that we're trying to make sure that your policies are robust and address a number of different kind of topics. Some of those topics that we'll kind of use for evaluating it is anything from like, does your policies support affordable housing or partnerships, or does it support mixed use developments and accessory dwelling units? And I can say, without having taken a real close look at your policies, you are already addressing a number of these, and that's something that we'll be able to document. But for any of those where you may not have a policy in place, or your policy could possibly be strengthened a little bit further, what we'll do is we'll provide recommended updates to those, so that as this goes forward with adoption, you could say, you know, these are the new policy statements that we want to include that will help us as a city meet the housing need over the 20-year time frame and ultimately the 50-year time frame, because this is just a smaller piece of a greater planning effort. Next slide, please. And then the more interesting part is we're going to present a number of different strategies that the city can do. I think of these as the different types of tools in the toolbox that the city can use for addressing housing need over the 20-year time frame. And there's about 20 of them. There's 18 examples that will be included in the report, give or take, maybe one or two. And they kind of fit a number of different areas, and then organize them into 4 different kind of broad categories. The first one is the land supply one, which is probably the one most people think of when they think of trying to address housing needs. And that includes, you know, your urban growth boundary expansion, which unfortunately, you know, just based off of the requirement that we use PSU's numbers is not on the table at this point. But you know, we also recognize that the city's on the margin there, and I think that Lori and the rest of the planning staff have had really great foresight in terms of taking a broader look and going with that 50-year time frame to make sure, because you are on the margin. I think we all recognize that that, you know, you're still making sure you're planning for that. And then another one is just rezoning land, something that I think will probably be one of our recommendations that we put front and center most of all, just because we've seen a deficit of land for kind of your medium and your higher density housing types. Your commercial land is kind of being taken up at the expense of potentially commercial development, when you should have at least an adequate supply of higher density zones. But I mean, that doesn't mean that, you know, there are a number of different tools out there. And there's, I know that there's a number of different things out there, and these are a lot of things that people don't necessarily think of right away when they think of, like, how can we meet our housing need over the next 20 years? And the next category there is the policy and development code updates. And there are 6 strategies to that. And to some extent, you're already doing some of these, and to another extent, you know, maybe we want to push or pull those levers a little bit stronger, and we'll look into that in closer detail as we move forward in this project. But, you know, one of those is just making sure you can build more housings on your land, making sure you can do different enough types of housing so that the market can respond quickly. Minimum density standards, is something that is in the toolbox there, just ensuring that you're getting a certain number of units, accessory dwelling units. I know you're already doing that to some extent, but we could look at maybe making that a little bit easier, or making some recommendations to make that a little bit easier. And then just incentives, regulatory incentives, or reducing regulatory barriers to housing. These are all things that, you know, you can do to try and entice some of those people who, not necessarily, I mean, obviously people who are going to keep the land in their family, and we can see it as partially vacant, but they have no intention of doing that. But some people might be on the margin. Some people might say, well, you know, it pencils out now. And that could be, you know, one of the policy or code tools that we can use for that. Before I jump to the next slide and talk a little bit more on some of the strategies, any questions on this slide here with some of the housing strategies that are on the presentation? Okay.
Lori, I do
next-
have a question. CJ,
Yeah.
I have a question about that. So the last time we looked at, when was the last time we looked at 3 through 8?
In 2018, we made
2018.
quite a few changes to the development code already.
Right. So, and that's an interesting, Scappoose is in an interesting position, having done an H&A pretty recently. And this is something that we'll spend some time talking with staff over, what worked well, what you liked, what hasn't worked well, and what can be tweaked. So just because I think just because it was done in 2018 doesn't mean we shouldn't have a discussion about it, or at least consider it. But you know, if that consideration has been made and says like, well, we don't need to do any more of that, then we don't need to move that recommendation forward, or we could say it's a low priority for the city to do.
Yeah, and I think it's important to document, obviously, like the changes that have been made, but I don't think anyone here would not want to hear, you know, what your professional opinion is, or what other communities might be doing well. You know, just because we made some changes, I think we still want to hear what the options are and what maybe some good ideas are for sure.
Mm-hmm.
Christine?
I guess this might be small on my part, but my reaction to is if when they come, we're just going to stack them in like cordwood. It just seems to try to squish as many people into the limited amount of land that we have. It makes me sad for Scappoose.
Well, I would say though, yeah, I hear what you're saying. You know, nobody wants that much growth
I didn't
necessarily, but
think of this place as an urban, but when he was going through these, I'm just like, well, this is downtown Portland.
not quite.
I mean, without the tents, because we don't.
But there were the majority of housing type, if we want to go back, I mean, we're already projecting that the majority of the new housing units would be single family residential detached for the most part. So, I mean, that's baked into it. So the percentages.
Lot requirement.
What's that?
We have a minimum lot requirement.
Of course.
So, sorry, go ahead.
So it's been reduced as part of the code changes from 2018. Before, our low density R1 zone had a minimum lot size of 7,500 square feet. It went down to 6,000 as a result of the last code changes. Our moderate density was 6,000, went down to 5,000. And then there were some changes to the duplex and quadplexes, et cetera. So we did tune those things up. We did reduce our minimum lot sizes for all of our residential zones during 2018. So on that particular issue, I don't know that there's going to be a huge appetite to go any smaller than that for those particular zones, the low and the moderate. But these are things that we'll talk about.
Mm-hmm.
I just ask a follow-up to that. So what has been proposed in the most dense portion of Buxton for that development parcel? Was that the 5,000 square feet?
So that's different. And the reason that's different is because it's a planned development. And a planned development is for properties that have some sort of physical constraints, usually is where we'll see that. And so the Buxton property, for anyone who doesn't know, is a large open parcel south of Veterans Park. And they've already held a neighborhood meeting, and they're going through a process to develop the land and modify the floodplain boundaries on that property. That has not gone to Planning Commission yet. I don't want to talk about it much because, again, it has not gone to Planning Commission. But in that, it's different because it acts as a zone change on that one parcel, and the city gets to request open space, and there's a lot more leeway to ask for what we want, and in return to that, the applicant gets to request to change setbacks, minimum lot sizes, etc. So they're not falling under the same minimum lot size as a standard subdivision. It would be more like what you would see in the South Fork subdivision, which is just west of the Fred Meyer development. That's a planned unit development.
There's
So it's totally,
potential to go even smaller than the 5,000.
yes, if they go through the planned development process, which is a much different process than a standard subdivision.
The positive thing about a planned unit, a planned development like that is it protects all that open space, and the developers required to put trails in and other amenities, and in turn can have a little tighter cluster of homes, keep it away from the creek banks, I think is.
Yep, that's exactly right.
Well, I think in 2018, to look at those changes and what did work well and what didn't accomplish what we wanted, it's a good opportunity, even though that was not too long ago, 4 years ago.
Sure.
But and 2 years before the pandemic, and then 2 years into the pandemic. But it'd be great to see and talk to CJ about what worked and what didn't.
Sure.
All right.
Go ahead, CJ.
Okay, let's go ahead and jump to the next slide, please. The next two kind of broad categories. Did I hear a question?
I don't think so.
Okay. So the next one is these are more kind of the carrots, if you will. The next set of categories are incentives, where you look at ways of trying to get cut the cost or make it a little bit more likely to pencil out from a financial perspective. And so those could be reduction or waiver to your system development charges, however they may apply. They could be tax exemptions or abatements for different types of housing. Those, if you want to target it for affordable housing or tie it to something along those lines, you can. Another thing is to look at your land use permit fees. Sometimes, depending on the city, those can add up to quite a bit. So if you're willing to take a lower fee on some of your land use permits, then it would potentially yield a little bit higher rate of development. And then looking at doing an expedited development review process, again, where you can kind of focus that on affordable housing, where you say, if you're doing this type of housing, it doesn't always have to be affordable housing, but it's usually the most common one. And say, like, if you're going to do this type of housing that is desirable or needed, we will provide a fast track of sorts through the land use process, because in all of these scenarios, these are fees that add to the bottom line for development. And at a certain point, it doesn't work financially, but if you can just whittle away on the margins, then you can probably get a few more housing units through that. So that'll be some areas where we'll present some options and discussion on. And then the next one is probably the most proactive on the city's behalf, where the city is actually funding or partnering or being proactive in terms of developing housing. And that can take on a number of different forms. Tax increment financing is a form of a taxing district that allows you to capture part of the tax revenue and redirect it into developing programs, developing or meeting programs. So that could be housing, but it could also be for commercial development, depending on how the district is set up. You can work on doing subsidized affordable housing and actually doing part of the land use applications for that. It ties in with public-private partnerships, which is something that we see not often, but we see frequently enough to say that, like, a city is working with developers for developing housing. Again, see it most commonly with affordable housing. The city can take an active role in actually purchasing land and using that as a way to bank for the future. And in those respects, then the city has a lot more say in terms of how it gets developed to meet those housing needs. And then the last two there are a little more indirect, but still very proactive, where the city takes a much more bigger role in terms of educating the public in terms of what sort of assistance, financial assistance, or home buyer programs are available out there. And then also trying to protect existing tenants through tenant protection programs and policies. So kind of two different ways to do it. And I imagine that some of these the city may have bigger appetites or smaller appetites for it, and that's be something that we can discuss further at more meetings, but we can talk a little bit about it now.
I have a question. Is tenant protection programs rent control?
Say it again, Brian.
Sorry, is tenant protection programs, is that rent control?
Rent control is one, I'm sorry.
Yeah, go ahead, Brandon.
I was just going to say rent control is one type of program that would fall under that, but not necessarily sort of eviction protections, arbitration ideas. There's a range of things, especially in the last 2 years since COVID. There were a lot of examples of different cities trying different things. So a lot could fall under that.
Okay, thank you.
Yeah, it could be things like notification of no cause evictions or rental relocation assistance, rental registrations or inspections.
Jennifer?
I have a question about system development charges. It's my understanding that in Oregon, if a city waives that they have to backfill it from another part of their budget. So I guess I'm surprised to see it on this list as an incentive.
I will say, pardon me, that the city traditionally has not ever wanted to really consider that or look at that because we rely on our SDCs so heavily.
Yeah.
And so I don't, while CJ is going to present all the available options for consideration, I mean, looking at this, I know there's some that just flat out won't work here. So while I can appreciate you want to see all the options, and some of these are really interesting to me, I know we've already talked about some of these a few years back. And again, we're going to have the conversation again because things are different now, and maybe there's a different appetite for some of these things. And, some of the funding sources and programs, especially like 1819, might be more well suited for a much larger agency than Scappoose. So I think this is the whole bucket of options. But once we start talking, I think definitely there's going to be some stuff that falls off.
Yeah, this is a starting point for us, and like I said, there'll be a lot more discussions about it. This being a preview, this will be refined more over time.
The discussion was just, we didn't think that the meeting would take the whole time because really it's a small portion of new information that was provided tonight. But, and so we discussed, well, let's go ahead and introduce these concepts because this will be the next portion that we're going to start looking at. And that way it's just, introduced to you a little bit earlier.
Are any of these concepts new from, say, 4 years ago? CJ?
From the last time the H&A was done, I don't know. I do know that the H&A that was done last time around, it wasn't done by us, so it took a little bit of a different approach to it. So I didn't see anything that was a kind of a parallel to presenting it in this way. So I can't do an apples to apples comparison along that respect. But after more discussion with city staff, we'll have a better understanding on, again, what works well, what didn't. And when I come back again, we'll be able to speak better to that.
I'd like to add that this isn't an exhaustive list. So, you folks are on the advisory committee, have different expertise in aspects of housing and on the ground experience in Scappoose. So if you have thoughts on anything else that should be on this list as a strategy or code changes that might be effective or anything, we'd love to hear it.
I guess my only comment is I see a lot of these that were looked at by the council in the past and kind of passed on all of them pretty much. And to me, in the end of the day, the biggest challenge is not that we need incentives to encourage housing. We places to put houses. It's really as simple as that. And I'm not sure how we get at that with the housing needs analysis. And
Yeah, and I think this to your point, I agree. It's not like, I mean, my desk is buried with applications right now. People are coming, they're coming. And so it's not a matter of incentivizing people to develop. It's what I'm hearing or what I'm seeing is it's incentivizing people who have partially vacant land to pretend, to be more apt to develop within that 20 years. But again, you're right. Council did not choose to go down any of these paths because of that issue. They felt like they didn't need to subsidize development because it was happening already. So, yeah, it's just a matter of is that 75% of land that's partially vacant actually going to develop in that 20 years? And this plan is not going to sit for 20 years. We're going to be watching it. And so as the population starts to increase and maybe we're hitting that 1.8 or we're hitting that 2% growth rate, we always have the opportunity then to update our studies and to have a trued up look at what our true housing need is if we are seeing more growth. We're not tied to this for the next 20 years.
I would also like to add one little point to what Mike said. It also seems like one of our drives here is to make affordable housing. The best way to make affordable housing is to have more land. It seems like more land is what solves our problems. It gives us places to build, both affordable and non-affordable. And then as you're trying to do infill on existing lots, the cost of land per unit goes up. And that also precludes affordable housing. So if we're looking for affordable housing, the best way to get it is to get more land. I understand we're confined by the state rules, but whatever we can do to stretch it to get as much land as we can get, I think would be in everybody's best interest.
Just the last thing, I'll shut up. I'm talking too much. I apologize again.
Love it when you talk, Michael.
We love it.
But I think if we could figure out how to incentivize folks to annex the city, I think one of the constraints is that when to annex your property, it costs you $5,000. And is there some way we can kind of encourage or incentivize that so that because I don't know how else you're going to get them to do that. I've seen that kind of an approach work successfully in other places.
Well, and having clear and objective standards to make it a process that's objective, it's clear, and it doesn't take a lot of time or extra money to do it. It's really important.
Another way to think about these as we go forward, we don't have to answer this now, but just to think about the types of housing that you maybe are not seeing right now. So if you're swamped with development applications, I'm assuming that most of those are for single family homes. I know you have had some multifamily development and so on, but that's the other part of this is sometimes a lot of these solutions jump out as being about affordable housing, but how can we think about these in terms of just getting multifamily market rate rentals built? Maybe you feel a need for some of those, maybe some of the medium density types, as long as they're happening in the what's thought of as a medium density zone. Maybe those aren't happening where you envision. So so please keep that in mind as well, is that another way to think about this is just, are we getting all the housing types we need, even in market rate housing? And also where the community would like to see that happen, zones in the proper place, what's going to be happening with your multifamily development, considering that it's in your commercial zones right now. So all these questions need to be considered.
I will say that is the end of the presentation that we have. We can jump to the next couple slides. Continue this discussion. I think we have plenty of time, and I'm happy to entertain. As long as my voice holds out, and and barring any further discussion, the final slide is some of the next steps for the committee there.
We have one more question or
yes.
point here.
I'm sorry. This is Deb Jacob from Columbia County. I'm just curious as to when, I know this is one piece of the puzzle, but when is the city going to look into the only way you can get increased housing is for services? When are you guys going to study what your capacity is for your water and your sewer? I think that's probably your next step.
Yeah, so let me look at the 50-year schedule. So we're at the HNA now. We'll be looking at other land needs. So the other types of land needs. So again, the school, public lands, park lands, etc. That's going to be started later this year in December. And then we'll start looking at the urban reserves and UGB analysis, which we'll get into some of the inventory discussions. It looks like next February to March.
Okay, is there any other discussion? Or CJ and Brendan, do you have, oh, actually, let's go to Kim. Kim, you go first.
Yeah, so just a question about the process here. So say we go through this, and it comes to conclusion before Portland State releases a new set of numbers. Are we going to be prepared? Are we kind of like doing two different models that we can pick up on? Or is this, if Portland State revises their numbers, do we start over again?
Yeah, that's a good question. So the MIG APG group, so Brendan and CJ and Darcy, they'll be wrapped up with their portion here this fall, October-ish, September, October. But because we don't get the new forecast, even the preliminary, until next spring, the thought was, in speaking with Beth Goodman, who is from the Echo Northwest team, to have a look at those preliminary numbers and see what they look like. If there's enough of a difference, and one caveat that she had said is, because she does HNAs around the state too, is don't be surprised if the number goes down. And so that was, just it didn't even occur to me that that could be a factor. But she said, you know, we'll look at that. And if, let's say there is, you know, the letter we send makes a difference, they dig into it, they decide, oh, okay, 2%'s better for Scappoose, we would pay the extra money to have everything retooled so that as we're moving forward from that point, we would look at the updated growth rate. Bottom line is this is a long-term plan. We knew it would span, you know, 3 fiscal years. And so, you know, for my budget, I bumped it up a little, knowing we could have things like that come up that we need to adjust. And it's just money well spent to adjust that before we move forward.
Based on
Oh,
the last one in 2018 to the baseline, it went down, right? Of course, the
Yeah,
baseline and
exactly.
adjusted one were kind of
And that's the trend.
different type of
Yeah.
analysis. So it'll be interesting to see what
Mm-hmm.
2023 comes up with. CJ and Brendan, did you have any questions of us as a committee as we, before you take it to the next step?
I think that's probably a good, I don't have any specific questions. That's probably a good transition into CJ talking about what's coming up next. And
Yeah. I will say I don't have any questions right now. Again, this particular meeting where the main focus of it was on the residential land needs analysis portion of it is pretty short and doesn't require a whole lot of comprehensive thought to it. So do appreciate the time spent here, and I'm hopeful that in terms of the next steps, the kind of the options that are presented there kind of give you some thought to take home with you and mull over a little bit, and that way we can be prepared to come back and actually have some good discussion, and we'll likely have a lot more questions then in terms of you know, this is what we see. Does that kind of fit with your process or what you're thinking or your understanding, and does that make sense? So we'll certainly have a lot more questions then. Moving on to this next steps, I will admit I incorrectly put in July as the month for all these dates, but it should all say June. We're not taking the next month off, so please forgive the error there. So yeah, this advisory committee meeting will meet again in a couple weeks on the 19th, and it'll be the Echo Northwest 3J side of the consultant team will be presenting more information on the outreach efforts that
I want,
they've been doing.
CJ, can I correct, just
Oh,
so
yeah.
nobody's writing down different? The advisory committee meeting date is correct. It is July 19th.
Okay. Thank you.
The only mistake you have up there is the other events is June 6th. And that's
Okay.
this coming up Monday. Everything else is right.
Thank you. Okay, thank you. That was what was throwing me off there. So yes,
Yeah.
it's a little out of order there, but in terms of what the advisory committee meeting is next meeting, that'll be with the other half of the team on another aspect of the 50-year project. And in terms of like what's happening next week, Brandon, Darcy, and I will be having a discussion with City Council and Planning Commission and sharing all the information that we've shared with you over the course of the last 2 meetings. We'll share it with them in a smaller, more condensed format. And then there'll be another City Council Planning Commission check-in work session with the other half of the team the day before they get to see you. And then the city has a farmers market open house going on July 23rd, which is another opportunity where I imagine we're not involved with that, but I think Echo Northwest and 3J are.
And then we'll have the just finalizing dates for the future stakeholder advisory committee meetings, and then the check-ins with Planning Commission and City Council. And early next week, I should have those dates for you through the end of this year.
Great. So the agenda is correct
Yes, it
with
is.
regard to dates.
The agenda is correct.
Everyone wants to just go with the agenda, then.
Yeah.
And that's gonna work out.
Yep.
And then CJ and Brendan, thank you for coming tonight. And if you can, with this group, take the feedback. You know, the group's had some great feedback, and if you can listen to that feedback and try to incorporate what you can, and then when you present to the Planning Commission, City Council, please include our feedback. It'd be great.
Okay, we will. Thank you.
Absolutely. I mean, the two kind of outstanding questions that I'm taking home with me today is the takings in terms of the UGB swipe, the possibility of that or how that works, and then maybe doing a partial ratio or a partial deduction for lots that require variances. And both of those things I'll discuss internally and reach out to DLCD as needed.
Thank you. Great. Any other discussion before we've already gone on to the next meetings, so hopefully you have them all on your calendar. Any other discussion? All right, meeting's adjourned. Thank you.
Thank you.
Night, everyone.
Thank you.